Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Huxleys, An Intimate History of Evolution, by Alison Bashford, narrated by Jennifer M. Dixon. Author's note on names. There are many Huxleys in this book. To distinguish between the two on whom I focus most closely, Thomas Henry Huxley and Julian Huxley, I use Huxley for the grandfather and Julian for the grandson. Introduction. How are humans animal, and how are we not? What is the nature of time, and how old is the earth itself? What might the planet look like, with or without humans, 10,000 years hence? More modestly, who asks such questions for a living, and who thinks they have the answers? Thomas Henry Huxley and his grandson Julian Huxley did. In 1947, they featured in Life magazine, One Dead, One Living. At the photo shoot in his Hampstead library, Julian self-consciously arranged himself in front of a portrait of his grandfather. In the foreground, a well-known mid-20th century science writer, zoologist, conservationist. In the background, a mid-19th century scientific naturalist, Charles Darwin's most outspoken spokesman. Julian was displaying his scholarly bloodline over one shoulder and the authority and expertise inherited from the library over the other, many of them his grandfather's own books. Well might he do so. Over the 19th and 20th centuries, these two men of science, these self-appointed cosmologists, communicated to the world the great story of evolution, including the birth, death, and rebirth of the idea of natural selection. They were trustees of evolution, a phrase that Julian often used to describe all of humankind, but which in truth applies more neatly to the Huxleys themselves. The younger man constantly fashioned himself after his Victorian grandfather, pursuing those signature Huxley knowledge quests, some profound, others simply grandiose. They were both remarkable, and both, on occasion, tortured. Writing these natural scientists together permits a kind of time-lapse over the 19th and 20th centuries, precisely because they were so similar. We might even think of them as one very long-lived man, 1825 to 1975, whose vital dates bookended the colossal shifts in world history from the age of sail to the space age, from colonial wars to world wars to the Cold War, from a time when the Earth was 6,000 years old, according to Genesis, to a time when it was 4.5 billion years old, according to rock samples returned from the Apollo missions. Two other portraits help us understand these trustees of evolution and how they were keen players in the great modern effort to comprehend and fix nature and culture. The likenesses are windows into their very different scientific souls, but we need not look into their eyes, rather at what they hold. Julian holds culture, an Igbo wooden sculpture from Nigeria, bought on the cheap in his West African travels in 1943. It was, he tells us, a sacred object, a small idol destined for household shrines. Instead, it ended up on a Hampstead shrine of a very different order. He was self-fashioning his curiosity and his cosmopolitanism, as well as his scientific inheritance. Student and lover of nature, inheritor of agnostics, brother of Aldous, believer in evolution by natural selection, and, his own invention, evolutionary humanism, Julian was, from the beginning, inclined to culture. Even as a zoologist, he was foundational to ethology, the study of animals' behavior and how they and we act, think, and even feel. Yet culture was itself part of evolution, and technically so, not just loosely or illustratively. Human minds are unique in evolutionary terms, Julian always insisted, precisely because we can comprehend just that. T.H. Huxley, by contrast, holds nature. Like a sovereign holding an orb, Huxley claims the skull of every man. The representative of God's dominion on earth is transformed into secular trustee of all humankind. His most famous likeness was captured in heavy Victorian oils by the celebrated portraitist John Collier, as it happens, Thomas Henry Huxley's son-in-law, Julian's uncle. The patriarch of one idiosyncratic family announces himself not just as patriarch of science, but also of what he called the man family, Homo sapiens, including its pre-human ancestors. This cranium was highly symbolic, as the family artist well knew, a sign of Huxley's ascendancy over British natural sciences and a secular talisman of his great intervention, evidence as to man's place in nature. One winter's evening in 1867, T.H. Huxley delivered a lecture on ethnology, the science of man, to working men in the Mechanics' Institute in Chancery Lane, and was enjoined to take a collection to relieve distress in the East End. Huxley said he would simply place his own subscription in one of the skulls on the table, and others could follow if they wished. A human skull served as a receptacle for the collection, the strangest secular offertory box. The entire lecture hall fell in with this mixed choreography of ethnology, self-help, poor relief and almsgiving. Many would then, as now, rightly consider human remains to be somehow sacred, certainly as sacred as the effigy Julian held. Yet Huxley the grandfather comprehended nothing of the sort. Skulls were workaday material objects, fascinating, but in no sense sacrosanct. Neither in death nor in life was the human body the receptacle of a soul. At least we can never show that to be the case, Huxley, the agnostic, insisted. He battled his whole life for nature and for a strictly scientific method to understand it. The modernization of natural sciences, of which Huxley was a key player, even dramaturge, challenged the magical and the supernatural. It heralded the death of the divine disenchantment, as the sociologist Weber had it, the death of God according to the philosopher Nietzsche. In different ways they were both responding to the ascendance of scientific naturalism that T.H. Huxley spearheaded, and in a German scholarly tradition in which Huxley was deeply learned, self-taught, of course. There are no spirits, no creator, no divine, at least none of which we can be sure. Wonderful, Huxley would have exclaimed had he lived long enough to read the great scholarly debates that unfolded on secularization and disenchantment over the 20th century. And yet he might also have questioned why, then, his biologist grandson Julian was so drawn to sacred idols, studied parapsychology, and wondered occasionally about ghosts. Why his literary grandson Aldous sought radically other perceptions and doors into them. Not to mention his anthropologist great-grandson Francis Huxley, who became so immersed in the magical and the mystical, in voodoo and in rituals of sacralization, as to become himself a kind of animist. One trajectory of this intimate history of evolution, according to the thesis of disenchantment, should be a history of secularization, a victory of T.H. Huxley's rational agnostics in a dynasty of scientists. In fact, it is a story of Huxley re-enchantment. Over 3 and 4 generations of modernity, the Huxleys searched proactively for something to put in the place of religion compatible with grandfather's scientific naturalism, but somehow exceeding it. Julian ended up a kind of neo-romantic naturalist, complete with visions and poetry, closer in some ways to the early 19th century Naturphilosophie that his grandfather had railed against. In short, these Huxleys travelled over the modern period symbolically from the disenchanted skull object of nature to the enchanted carved, sacred object of culture, not the reverse. Julian sometimes even imagined himself as a kind of creator who bestowed his own word on humankind. Evolutionary humanism. Or perhaps, like Moses, he authored this new scientific religion for the world, truth certainly not acquired from heaven, but instead from earth, from nature itself. The cranium that Thomas Henry Huxley holds with such propriety, almost defiance, stands for the species Homo sapiens. But we know that a particular human used to be in it, used to be it. It once held a brain, a mind, a consciousness, a human, or perhaps a pre-human being, even if, for Huxley, a soulless one. But agnosticism about a soul did not mean that Huxley wasn't interested in feeling. On the contrary, consciousness and perception, sense and sensation were all fascinating to him as a physiologist and a learned philosopher of mind, not just a comparative anatomist. He was a relentless inquirer into how the brain and mind inside a human skull senses, thinks, perceives, feels, and does so similarly to, or differently from other animals, radically extending ancient debates about human reason and animal instinct. Well known as a founder of British anthropology, he was part of the beginning of psychology too. By his grandson Julian's early adulthood, this particular Huxley family inquiry had evolved from studies of consciousness and unconsciousness, mesmerism, hypnotism, anesthesia, reflex, to the analysis of a 20th century phenomenon called the unconscious. Julian consumed Freud, and by the 1950s and 1960s, the Huxley brothers, Julian and Aldous, were actively wondering about altering consciousness through telepathy, through Vedanta, through mescaline and LSD. The brother who lived in safe and cosy Hampstead was a philosopher of new kinds of human perception at one remove. The brother who lived in edgy California was a practitioner, fully immersed in new experiential perception. The material relationship between a skull, a brain, a mind, and individual human consciousness turned out to be intergenerational Huxley business. It turned out to be intergenerational Huxley suffering as well. Here, the history of evolutionary ideas becomes as intimate as it is possible to be. The Huxleys were a family deeply afflicted by mental illness, and they were a brilliant and inquiring family. They both embodied and thought through genius and melancholy as these states had been imagined and put together over the 19th century in science and letters, and in the 20th century by psychoanalysis, behavioral psychology and psychopharmacology. A Huxley collective depression was only matched by the family capacity to think about it in highly curious ways, to be intrigued by the mysterious relationship between mind and body via the brain that sat inside those skulls. The grandfather and grandson looked often to outer worlds and sometimes to other worlds. They were cosmologists of sorts. Over their lifespans, 1825 to 1975, time got longer and longer, the past deeper and deeper, not just the prehistory of humans, but also the geohistory of the Earth. This was a phenomenal conceptual revolution, yet this one long-lived man was Janus-faced with regard to the time revolution, the Victorian Huxley looking backwards to a receding past, while Julian, the modern, was enchanted by the temporal beyond. Julian's compelling non-fiction essays about the future of humankind and even of the planet were perhaps offset by his second-rate science fiction attempts, shadows of his brother's brilliance. Yet in the 20th century, Julian and Aldous Huxley shared visions of all kinds of possible new worlds, an intellectual and fraternal intimacy of a profound order. As often as they looked to outer or future or nether worlds, the Huxleys looked inwards into their very selves. Such introspections were sometimes public in the form of poetry books and unrestrained memoirs, or else were entwined in essays on religion, on ethics, on philosophies of knowing and ways of being. For neither Thomas Henry nor Julian Huxley were their depressions ever fully hidden or sequestered, and this introspection rarely manifested as withdrawal from the world. Thomas Henry Huxley was hardly retiring. He was both self-made and self-satisfied, especially over his fights with the world. He was a big personality, bold and fractious, yet he nurtured honest, emotional, and not infrequently confessional intimacies with his many close friends, men of science and men of God. Victorian masculinity was so much more forgiving and enabling than its caricature of repression. Thomas Henry Huxley needed it to be. His struggle with melancholy was relieved in meaningful ways by his tight scientific circle. Thomas Henry Huxley's character booms through the records, but what was Julian Huxley like? There is no lack of description, since his circle included as many poets and writers as biologists, observers, good with their words and sharp with their insight. It puts him at an unfair disadvantage, biographically speaking. One author, who married into the wider family, Elspeth Huxley, found him rude, vain, and selfish. Another writer, who knew him well, thought him brilliant, charming, idealistic, gregarious, but also unstable, full of self-doubt, and a raging egotist. After Julian's death in 1975, the distinguished American poet, May Sarton, wrote to his wife Juliet, diagnosing without mercy, "A very spoiled baby person." This intimate history is more sympathetic to Julian. Partially hidden to such poet-observers, but known too painfully by his long-suffering wife, who had her own elegant and honest words to put to her life partner, was Julian's paralyzing depression. On occasion, his mind and body slowed almost to a standstill, his soul all but too heavy to bear, his affliction dreaded and terrible. An accomplished poet himself, when Julian was unable to gather words coherently to describe anything, let alone such pain, he reached for those of others, confessing publicly how his mind and soul were tortured, how he lived Walt Whitman's terrible words, "Hell under the skull bones, death under the breastbones." The family's most famous wordsmith, Aldous, reintroduced to the 20th century another term, axidy. Chaucer's Middle English described the condition that forsloweth and forsluggeth a man. This was what was passed from Thomas Henry Huxley to his grandson, and what was inherited here and there across the wider Huxley family. In the psychoanalytically intense 1920s, Julian disclosed to the world the crippling melancholy he shared with his grandfather, that is to say, crucially and technically, that he knew he had inherited. His public honesty in early adulthood makes the child's hand in this early studio portrait, softly covering, claiming, seeking, his grandfather's, poignant and painful. It holds a truth. These men of science were privately tied together by their suffering. Publicly and professionally, they were tied together by Julian's own hand, by his work and will, as he actively grafted himself onto his grandfather's lineage. T.H. Huxley, 1825 to 1895, was one of the Victorian world's best-known zoologists and comparative anatomists, doggedly promoting and defending Charles Darwin in the earliest public dispute over the theory of evolution by natural selection. Huxley was up for the fight. He sought it, enjoyed it, won it. In the process, he challenged Britain's established power structures, most especially the Church of England. Raised outside London and then in the Chartist Midlands in an educated but struggling and socially declining family, Huxley was not simply granted his position as Professor of Paleontology and Natural History at the Royal School of Mines, what had started as the Museum of Economic Geology and became Imperial College London. Rather, he fought for it, retaining a lifelong belief in merit-based rewards and effort-based achievement over inherited authority and position. This stance was explicit and political, sometimes bitter and always antagonistic. It rocket-fueled his battles against conventions, against authorities, and against orthodoxies. The explosive idea of evolution by natural selection was as suited to Huxley's character as it was a paralyzing ill match for Charles Darwin. Together, and with a close circle of like-minded friends, they drove a new scientific naturalism in the middle of the 19th century, contesting any explanation of nature, old or new, that relied on a beyond-natural or supernatural force or origin. Victorian science and letters were conjoined when Huxley's son, Leonard, married Julia Arnold of the literary family, Thomas Arnold, Matthew Arnold, Mary Arnold, Mrs. Humphrey Ward. Julian was their first surviving child, born in 1887 and crossing vital dates with his famous grandfather for 8 important years. The eldest of 4 siblings, with Noel Trevelyan, 1889 to 1914, Aldous Leonard, 1894 to 1963, and Margaret Arnold, 1899 to 1981. His pastoral Surrey childhood was spent in bird-watching, verse lessons and German induction. Julian was a beneficiary of his grandfather's fights in scientific and educational fields. A great rise in family fortunes saw him a student at Eton and then Balliol College, Oxford, from 1906. There, natural sciences had completely transformed from his grandfather's era. Julian learned evolutionary theory as a matter of course, not as a matter of controversy, but he also studied the then strong critique among scientific discontents about natural selection specifically. A technical problem with Darwinian natural selection was something that Julian helped communicate and resolve in the 1930s and 1940s, what he called the modern synthesis of Mendelism and Darwinism, genetics and evolution. In a remarkable turnaround, one that we can put down to larger-than-life H.G. Wells, Julian traded in an academic career in zoology for what we would now call science communication. He went on to become an adventurous communicator in media, unimaginable to his grandfather, in broadcasting, in film, and eventually in early television. He even won an Oscar. In so many ways, Julian Huxley was David Attenborough's antecedent. More than that, in the early 1950s, Julian Huxley was in front of the camera with a young David Attenborough, producer, behind it. Along the way, and in between paralysing depressions, Julian was controversial secretary of the London Zoo in the late 1930s and equally controversial Director-General of UNESCO in the late 1940s. He was an A-listed international speaker on population control in the 1950s and 1960s, the catastrophic era when the end of the world seemed imminent. Ours is not the first generation to think so. The grandfather invented the term agnostic. The grandson followed through, inventing the term transhumanism, the idea that both individual humans and the species as a whole can be radically enhanced and improved, mentally and physically. Highly political in a remarkable era when many natural scientists were just that, Julian offered key public statements about the human species and its variations. He was an anti-fascist signatory to the so-called Geneticists' Manifesto, 1939, that opposed Nazi racial dogma and early driver of UNESCO's anti-racist statements on race for the New World after fascism and after the Holocaust. He was also post-war president of the British Eugenics Society, an apparent contradiction that in fact was perfectly reconcilable in his own intellectual ecosystem. We shall see how and why. As an elderly man, Julian put his name to the Humanist Manifesto, 1973, carrying signature Huxley rationalism into the age of Aquarius. What agonized Julian Huxley personally fascinated him intellectually. What do we inherit and what inheres in us? What happens over and between generations of living beings? How are similarity and variation carried forwards over time, measured in the generational years of a family tree, in the tens of thousands of years in the tree of man, or even more expansively in the great geological epochs in the tree of life? What do we really know about breeding, whether of peas, pigeons, horses, or humans? The family history of the Huxleys doubles as an account of evolving ideas about generations and genealogy, genes and eugenics. Evolution on the one hand and inheritance on the other are two very different natural phenomena, both revolutionized by and through Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace's idea, natural selection. Evolution was T.H. Huxley's intellectual business in the 19th century, while genetic inheritance was Julian's in the 20th. Combinations and recombinations of Huxley's and Darwin's routinely drew down on their shared intellectual legacy, sometimes looking to their own ancestry, eventually to consider how selective breeding might be brought to humans as individuals, as families, as societies, as a species. They began to connect the idea of improved inheritance and the possibility of social interventions into the reproduction of mental and physical states. Generations of 20th century Darwins and Huxleys crossed paths in and around the Eugenics Society in London, rebooting an idea born from Charles Darwin's interest in artificial selection and folding it into Mendelian genetics on the one hand, and modernist futurism, even progressivism, on the other. Thomas Henry Huxley was not so sure about this ambition to improve future humans. Julian Huxley was 100% sure. For decades now, historical and political analysis of eugenics has rightly bedded down a wide-ranging critique of its ambitions as a race-oriented program linked to genocide. It is difficult to comprehend how, for some post-war actors like Julian Huxley, eugenics and opposition to biological racism were compatible. For Julian, the Nazi version of eugenics was just that, a dangerous, misplaced expedient program, egregious in its racist implementation. Strange to say, for him, eugenics needed rescuing, not abandoning. At one level, this is explained by the fact that British eugenics was in the first instance about mental health and ill health, fitness and unfitness in early 20th century language, rather more than an intervention into race difference, race policy, or racial reproduction of various kinds. Implicitly and occasionally explicitly, British eugenicists discussed the race, by which they sometimes meant the nation, sometimes the species, Homo sapiens. Occasionally they did mean white or Caucasian, Negro or Asian, or Aryan, or 100 other spurious divisions of humankind. Herein lies a history of the very idea of race, the actual term, as its meaning changed from species differentiation to intra-human difference. Thomas Henry Huxley generally disavowed the term race with regard to humans, preferring stocks, while his grandson influentially argued from population genetics that there was no such biological thing as race, installing instead the idea of cultural ethnicity.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?